Shavua Tov, everyone. I hope you are all doing well. And I'm excited since today we get to start a new book, Sefer Nechemia. Although, as we mentioned, it's not really a new book, it's the continuation of Ezra. Last week, we finished Sefer Ezra. We finished learning about Ezra. Although, as we learned, as mentioned, Ezra and Nehemiah are kind of intertwined with one another. And what I want to do today, as I did with Sefer Ezra, I would like to give an introduction, a very overview of who Nehemiah is, what he did, just certain parts of important things that he had done, so that we can go into Nehemiah knowing a little bit what to expect. But also it's important to get the background story. So I'm just going to start with something that we dealt with a little bit last time we started Sefer Ezra, and that is the method of dating the period of time. If you recall, I mentioned it in passing. I didn't really focus on this, but there are basically three existing methods that try to set a time frame for Ezra and Nehemiah as their ascent and aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. In general, today's class is based on a paper that I wrote in 2014. I wrote a paper for the Open University for their Machlaka of Yahadut. Baruch Hashem, I was able to write a ma'amar, and I'm basing my knowledge today on all of the academia that came that tried to figure out the time period of where Ezra and Nehemiah is at this point. So I'm going to really base it on this ma'amar paper that I wrote, and I'll be elaborating on it as well as we go forward. So like I said, there are basically three methods that exist of the time frame, and it's important for us to know these methods. The first one is the traditional approach, the Masoret, which is basically based on Pshuto Shel Mikra. And it believes that Ezra immigrated in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, which is basically, as I mentioned many times, 458 BCE, which is before the Aliyah of Nehemiah, who immigrated to Yerushalayim 445 BC, which is 13 years after Ezra. So we have Ezra first, and then we have 13 years later, we have Nehemiah. And this is really Pshuto Shel Mikra. It's basically the first pasuk in the first perek of Nehemiah. If you open up your Tnachim, your Sefer, it starts with Divrei Nehemiah ben Chachaliah. And then it says, Vayi bechodesh Kislev, Shnat Esrim, Ve'ani hayiti b'Shushan HaBira. Right, and we saw that the beginning of Ezra starts b'Shnat Sheva le'Artaxerxes. So between 7 and 20, there's 13 years. Mamash Pshuto Shel Mikra. But according to this method, that is really pashut, there are several problematic psukim verses that make it extremely difficult to understand the chronological order. So I'm not going to go into them today, but we will discuss them at another time, okay? Maybe I'll go into one, just to show you an example of what I mean of problematic psukim. So if we go to Nehemiah, Perek Yud Gimel, right? If you go to the last Perek, if you go to Perek Yud Gimel, in Nehemiah, Pasuk Yud Gimel, it says there that Nehemiah appoints 4 faithful Kohanim to be the treasurers of the Beit HaMikdash. I'm going to read inside, okay? So Perek Yud Gimel, Pasuk Yud Gimel. Okay, I'm reading from Sefer Nehemiah. It says there, Va'otzera al otzarot shel Yirmiyah HaKohen ve'Tzadok HaSofer ufdaya min haleviim ve'al yadam Chanan ben Zakur ben Matanya ki ne'emanim nechshavu ve'aleihem la'achlok la'acheihem. So Nehemiah appoints 4 people to be the treasurers of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, that's really not a big deal. It's very important. It's nice that he did that. But when Ezra arrives in Yerushalayim, he gives if you recall, he comes with a lot of money and gold, and he gives all of the money and the silver that he has, that he's responsible for the Beit HaMikdash. And if you open up in Ezra, Perek Chet, Pasuk Yud Gimel, it says there, Uvayom HaRevi'i Nishkal HaKesef VeHaZahav VeHaKelim Beveit Eloheinu Al Yad Meremot Ben Uriah HaKohen Ve'imo Elazar ben Pinchas Ve'imahem Yozavad ben Yoshua Ve'Noadia ben Binui HaLevi'im. 4 people. So Ezra comes away, according to the traditional approach, comes to Eretz Yisrael, to Yerushalayim, to the Beit Mikdash, 13 years before Nehemiah, and he hands over the gold and silver to 4 people. So, although he gives it to 4 different people, the different names than the ones that Nehemiah appointed, however, had it not been for Nehemiah's appointment, there wouldn't be anyone responsible in the Beit HaMikdash. Meaning, why is it that when Ezra comes, there are 4 people that are in charge of the treasurer? It must mean that Nehemiah preceded Ezra, and Nehemiah came before Ezra Sofer. So there are many more not many, but there are a few more psukim that pose a problem that show in a way that Nehemiah came before Ezra Sofer, which is the exact opposite of the traditional approach. So again, the traditional approach basically is the Pshuto Shel Mikra. Ezra comes 458, 13 years later, Nehemiah comes. But we're going to have some problems with some psukim that really show that it could be that Nehemiah came to Yerushalayim before Ezra, and we're going to have to solve those problems to show that really Ezra came beforehand. That's according to the traditional approach. There's another approach, and that is, it's called the radical approach, right? Which basically is an antithesis to the traditional approach that we just said. Basically, it claims that Ezra immigrated to Eretz Yisrael, to Yerushalayim, in year 7, Sheva le'Artaxshasta, but not the first Artaxshasta, Artaxshasta HaSheni, which is basically 397 BCE, right? Almost 60 years later than 458, the way the traditional approach goes, right? So according to this, Ezra came to Israel long after Nehemiah, and they didn't meet at all. So there is an approach like that in academia, which they deal with that, and they try to solve all the problems based on the fact that Ezra comes after Nehemiah. Another approach, interesting approach, is called the revised approach. Basically, what it tries to do, it's an approach that tries to bridge the 2 previous methods, the traditional one and the one we just explained, that basically Nehemiah really did precede Ezra, but this approach proves that Ezra did in fact meet Nehemiah during Nehemiah's second rule over Yerushalayim. We're going to see and we're going to learn that Nehemiah had basically 2 periods of different periods where he ruled over Yerushalayim. Right? He ruled over Yerushalayim for the first 12 years, and then he thought he succeeded, that he did his job. He goes back to Persia, and then when he hears that things are not going so well back in Yerushalayim, again he comes back for a second period. That's where he meets Ezra, and that's where together Ezra and Nehemiah lead Am Yisrael spiritually, and Nehemiah as governor. So that's an approach that exists as well, kind of bridging the 2 approaches. There is, however, a 4th method, which is basically called the Synchronic Approach. And what it tries to do is it tries to solve the problems of the chronology by assuming that both books, Ezra and Nehemiah, they're basically using 2 different methods to count the years. So when Ezra counts the Sheva Shanim, right, or however he goes by, he's basically counting according to the cycle of Shemitah, Shnot HaShemitah, okay? Which, like I always say, no coincidences. We just read on Shabbat all about Shemitah and Yovel, and here we are talking about years of Shemitah. In fact, on Shabbat, in the main drasha that I gave, I mentioned that Yovel, according to Rav Rishonim, is in 30 years from now. So it's amazing how there's an approach that says that Ezra counted according to the Shemitah years, while Nehemiah counted the years according to the years of the king Artaxerxes. So according to this calculation, Ezra arrives in Yerushalayim at the beginning of Chodesh Av, which we discussed, but not in 458 BC, rather in 443 BC, which was the year of Shemitah, which was at the beginning of the last stage of rebuilding a wall. Nehemiah, we're going to learn, builds the wall around Yerushalayim. So we're going to learn about that. And that's when Ezra meets Nehemiah, who arrives 2 years before him in 445. And this fits the Aliyah of Nehemiah, 445, according to our traditional approach as well. Meaning they did overlap. Ezra and Nehemiah overlapped. Having said all of that, we simply don't have enough conjunction. This is what the academic world assumes, but we don't have enough information to really accurately verify this chronology. Therefore, in our class, as I mentioned already in the class when we started Sefer Ezra, we're following the traditional method. Basically means that Nehemiah makes Aliyah 13 years after Ezra, which basically means that Ezra set the stage for Nehemiah. We discussed Ezra. I don't want to summarize everything we learned about Ezra yet, because we could only do it properly after we learn about Nehemiah. And the reason is because we're going to see the differences between them, and it will sharpen our understanding of the leadership of Ezra versus the leadership of Nehemiah. And that's really what our class is really all about. Two legends, yet two different types of leadership. And we're going to see, and we might even face one versus the other. We can choose which one we like better, which leadership we think is better. And additionally, we can bring those two leaderships to the stage that we live in today, in modern era, and see which one is more relevant to us. Are they both relevant? Maybe we can find a third approach that combines the two. Aval od chazon lamoed. So let's talk about Nehemiah. Let's talk about the person that we mentioned is called Nehemiah ben Chachaliah. Okay, in Perek Aleph. So basically, Nehemiah, as we said, we're following the traditional approach, immigrates to Yerushalayim 445 BC, which is 13 years after Ezra Sofer comes to Eretz Israel. And according to his testimony, now, unlike the beginning of Sefer Ezra, which basically was, if you recall, was the account of the memories of Ezra's memories in the account of someone else, meaning he didn't live during that time period, but only in Perek Zayin, Chet, Tet, etc., we hear Ezra speaking in the first person because he's relaying his memories to us. Perek Aleph, the beginning of Sefer Nehemiah, begins immediately with Nehemiah talking. According to his testimony, that he gives, he was the cup bearer to the king. If you go to Perek Aleph, you go to Pasuk Yud Aleph, okay, the last pasuk of Perek Aleph, it says who he was. He says the last 4 words, Ve'ani hayiti mashke lamelech. I was back in Babylon, before I got to Yerushalayim, I used to be the cup bearer of Melech Artaxerxes. A very important job, right? If you recall, there was another person who was a cupbearer who also had a very, very important job. If you recall his name, we don't know his name, but we know that he's called Sar HaMashkim. Sar HaMashkim basically had the power to save Yosef. Basically, Sar HaMashkim changed the entire fate of the Egyptian empire. If it wasn't for Sar HaMashkim, Yosef wouldn't have emerged. He wouldn't have saved Egypt. So in a way, whether hinting or not, Nehemiah is telling us, I am a cupbearer. I'm coming to save the fate of Yerushalayim, which is darsheni, because we just said we're following the traditional approach, which means that Ezra preceded him. Aha. So what does it mean he's coming to save it if Ezra was already here saving Yerushalayim? Before we answer that question, let's just see that it's interesting that based on Nehemiah's testimony, it also indicates, and this is something that we see all over the world today as well, that the Jews of Bavel, of Babylon, reached high positions politically in the courts of the king. If he was able to be a mashkel melech, a cupbearer, it must mean that Jews, allocated Jews, were in places of power within the Persian Empire. So we saw Ezra, who was a scribe, right? But being a scribe to a king doesn't necessarily mean you're in a high place of power. It means you're just a scribe. You're just, writing down everything that you hear for future, so that the king can look at it, right? We saw that with the Melech Achashverosh when he asked for the book to read what happened to him with Biktana V'Teresh, etc. But a mashkel melech, a cupbearer, is also physically close to the king. And what can someone who physically is close to the king, he can influence the opinions of the king as well. So, just like I don't know if this is true or not, but we have a member in our shul, David Friedman, who was close to Trump as well. So who knows? What positive impact he had on the previous administration, the president of America, Trump. And here too, it could be that Nehemiah had a place of power influencing the Persian king himself by being a cupbearer. It's pretty close. But there is a scholar, and I remember writing that there's a scholar named Yamauchi. He's from University of Miami, and he believed that we can't prove that Nehemiah indeed was a minister, especially not a cupbearer to the king. Why? It's very interesting because a cupbearer, and if it was possible that Nehemiah was a cupbearer, then we would have to prove that Nehemiah was a eunuch, right? Why? Because I'm sure most of you remember a cupbearer. We see that in Megillat Esther, a minister that works so closely to the king, gives him literally his mashke, his wine, his alcohol. So they made sure, all kings during this period of time made sure that their cupbearers were castrated, that it was acceptable. It was a condition upon taking upon themselves this job as being a cupbearer. Why? Because kings feared that their cupbearer was also very close to the kings, their king's women, right? Their concubines, etc. They would fall in love or lust after one of them. And therefore, they might poison the king because they're so close to him in order to take one of these women. Therefore, it was a custom that they were all eunuchs. And we see that also with Megillat Esther, Sris HaMelech, Hegai Sris HaMelech, right? They were all like that. We see that also in Egypt as well. So therefore, he says that the only way it could be true that Nehemiah was a cupbearer means that he was a eunuch, and we can't really prove it one way or another. But putting him aside, either way, it hints to show that Jews were integrated well. They attained high leadership positions in the Babylonian, the Persian Empire. And therefore, because of that, similar to Ezra, but different, Nehemiah is able to ask King Artaxerxes to be governor over Yerushalayim and Yehuda. Now, the question we're going to be asking once we go in time is why does he need to be a governor of Yehuda if Ezra is already there? Another question that is asked by those approaches that try to say that Nehemiah was actually first. We're not going to say that. We're going to say this probably is because it could be that Nehemiah heard about Ezra's efforts to change the spiritual situation in Yerushalayim and in Yehuda, and possibly, the lack of, hands-on leadership that of Ezra, as we explained in detail, that Ezra chose not to use his authority to force the people of Yerushalayim into anything, really. He didn't force them to expel their women. He didn't force them to take upon themselves the Torah, but rather he did it very, very strategically, right? He caused them to want the change. He was very persuasive, but he didn't force them. Maybe Nehemiah doesn't think that approach is working. He wants to go in and really change everything. He wants to be a different type of a leader, right? We have that all over the place. You see how one leader acts, what one leader does, and you think you could do a better job, right? So maybe that's one of the reasons. He said, I hear what Ezra is doing. He's doing a good job, but I think we could elevate the Jewish people back in Yerushalayim. This also may hint that Nehemiah might have disagreed with Ezra's approach completely. Additionally, it can also indicate that perhaps, and I'm saying perhaps because I don't know this, the Jews of Bavel were spiritually strengthened. Maybe they heard of the positive things happening in Yerushalayim with Ezra, and they became more spiritually strengthened, and they were longing for the land of Eretz Yisrael. Kind of like in our days, some of us make aliyah. Why? Because you want to be connected to Eretz Yisrael. Some people don't want to make aliyah. But those who do are, for the right reasons, they want to be in Israel. They see Israel as a place to raise your kids. Israel is a place to be able to be closer to God, to be able to really be more religious. So it could be that Nehemiah, there's an awakening of a spiritual atmosphere because of what they're hearing of what's going on in Eretz Yisrael by Ezra. And this would show that Ezra indeed succeeded at his job, that he did a good job in really putting together a new, we mentioned how when we talked about his ascent to Eretz Yisrael, we discussed how it was kind of like an aliyah of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and why methodically he made sure there was water, a body of water there, and that Hashem was the one who was guiding him, kind of like the Amud Anan, kind of like really going into Eretz Yisrael spiritually to show and stir what was going on. So perhaps he did such a great job that it stirred some more Babylonians, Persians, to want to make aliyah. And Nehemiah wanted to be the one to lead them on his own as a new delegation, and the one to be in charge, right? He's bringing more people. He said, I want to be in charge. Nevertheless, the king officially appoints him to become governor of Eretz Yisrael, of Yerushalayim and Yehuda. So that's kind of like the backstory of why and why all of a sudden and what's going on. Now, unlike Ezra, and this is very important because this is kind of a new leader being born, unlike Ezra, we're going to learn that Nehemiah left Persia fitting his position with authority, with an army, and with the force of the Persian Empire backing him. And as I just said before, Ezra was the exact opposite. Ezra had the ability, he had the authority to bring in an army to defend all the gold and silver that was coming in order to build the Beit HaMikdash, which also goes hand in hand with the traditional approach. But he didn't want to bring an army. He wanted the people of Israel, the Jewish people living in Yehuda and the outskirts, to really feel that God is guiding them, that God is protecting them. He was a spiritual man. He was a man who had reverence, who wanted to reenact a Matan Torah. He wanted to ignite the spark of connection to Am Yisrael, in a way like what Rav Kook tried to do when he became the chief rabbi of Israel. He wanted to spark a new way of living. He wanted to spark tzionut and achva and yahadut and Eretz Yisrael. He was Mekar of the Chilonim, the Datiim. He wanted to pick everyone, right? So therefore, he didn't want an army. God will protect us, even though it was a difficult journey, right? But Nehemiah was the exact opposite. No, if I was given the authority, if I'm given the ability, why not come and show how strong us Jews are? We're coming in with a great, great army, the backing of the Persian army. Look what we can do. Also, possibly, he wanted to make a mark between all those foreigners that we discussed, right? The Shomronim and the others around them. Now, does this mean that Nehemiah was lacking faith in God? Not at all. As we're going to see, Nehemiah was a devout Jew, feared God. He just felt that a different approach was needed. Maybe he thought that there's only so much Ezra can do with his persuasion. We saw Ezra was very, very smart. He cried and he tore his garments and he made the people of Israel want to take upon themselves. But it's a far cry convincing somebody and actually doing it. And and Nehemiah is a doer. He said, you know what? I might not have the genius or the Torah knowledge that Ezra has. What do I have going for me? I was the cupbearer. I know government. I know how to establish order, and that's what I'm going to do. So we're going to learn, again, unlike Ezra, that Nehemiah acted immediately. The second he comes to Yerushalayim, he doesn't stall. He doesn't wait a couple of months. We also show that when Ezra came, he came in Chodesh Av, and we see that the first time he actually does something was with that he tries with the expelling the women was in Kislev. And we kind of borrowed Perek Chet of Sefer Nechemia, and we threw it into Sefer Ezra, and we said that in Tishrei, a month and a half after Ezra came, he started reading the Torah to influence and inspire Am Yisrael living in Yehuda in that time. And that's what inspired the people to come forward and say, look, we have a problem. We see the Torah says, Kedushat Zera Kodesh, we have to get rid of our women and etc. But Nehemiah, he doesn't wait. He doesn't read the Torah. He doesn't start looking. He says immediately he wants to rebuild. The first thing that he does, rebuild the walls of Yerushalayim. Now, to build the walls of Yerushalayim is significant. It represents two ideas. Number one, physically building a wall, because that's the first thing you do. You want to build a nation. You want to build a stronghold. You want to be able to show that you're protecting the people. You build a wall, because during those days, during this time, right, that was the way to find security. You build a wall, and then you can control what goes on inside. So the first thing he does is he builds a physical wall. On another level, it could be that he was secluding himself from the foreign people, trying to build a stronghold of just Jewish people so that he can help Ezra, if indeed they really met, and we see later on that they do, that he enables them separation, because we know there's a need for separation, especially when you're trying to build. So the first thing he does is he builds a wall around Yerushalayim. Also, what he does, very important, forcing the nobility, the rich, to help the peasants, striving for social justice. It very, very much matters to Nehemiah, social justice. He was a man of ethics, a man of truth. He cared that everyone gets along, and also that the rich and the poor get along, and that there are no paupers, no poor people, and the rich need to look after the poor, because that's not the way to live. Again, amazing, similar to what we just read in Parshat Behar, the whole idea of Shemitah and Yovel, Achzarat Avadim, and that the Karkaot, the land goes back to the original owners. That's very important to Nehemiah. So he's a doer. He collects taxes. He restores order within the Beit HaMikdash. He banned work and commerce on Shabbat. That is very important. And he continued to strive for the expulsion that we saw that Ezra tried to do of the foreign women, that Ezra already started. So we see that he's a man of a ma'aseh. He doesn't try to persuade them. He doesn't try to cause them to want to be choser with tshuva. That's not his way. He is an ish ma'aseh. The first thing he does is the most physical thing he can, builds a wall around Yerushalayim. So on the one hand, Nehemiah does continue where Ezra left off, according to our traditional approach, where he comes after Ezra, building upon what Ezra had already done. But on the other hand, he does it forcefully, unlike Ezra, who preferred the power of persuasion and information, teaching the Jews to read the Torah, learning. Nehemiah also, as we see, punished those who did not accept his orders and instructions, very, very differently than Ezra. Ezra didn't want to punish. It's two different ways of chinuch, two different ways of leadership. That's very important. In addition, Nehemiah, as we're going to read, he advocates policy reforms and better maintenance of the region, not just the Beit HaMikdash area, not just the Ir HaAtikah, but rather the whole region. He was given the authority to uplift the entire place of his region. of Yerushalayim Rabati. So the first thing that he does, as we mentioned, is the construction of the wall. Now, when he comes to Yerushalayim, he arrives and he sees these walls breached. Why were they breached? Well, years and years of neglect, starting from the Churban Beit HaMikdash, many years before, 586 BCE, and he sees that it's neglected, years and years neglect. So it seems that our dating system, as we mentioned, that Ezra comes before Nehemia, if it's correct, it teaches us that Ezra, he's been in power for 13 years already. And I guess fixing up the walls weren't important enough for Ezra. He was focusing on the spirituality. He was focusing on Torah. He was focusing on celebration of the Shlosh Regalim, right? Sukkot and others. He wanted to restore faith. He wanted to restore the spiritual environment, the atmosphere, the Yahadut part, right? So during his time, 13 years passed and the walls weren't fixed. It's still in a terrible situation. In comes Nehemia, and the first thing he sees, he doesn't look for the spiritual element. He looks first and foremost, what can I improve in the city? Because in his mind, that's what we have to do if we want to create something new in Yerushalayim and better. So he goes around, and in some areas he sees that there is only a few remains of the wall left. In other places, there's full pieces of wall that are still standing, and yet in other locations, no traces of a wall left at all. Now we're going to see that Nehemia, with all of the greatness that he comes and with the trumpets coming with an army and gold and silver and everything, he still fears a resistance from the people living in the region, mainly the Shomronim. And Nehemia, though he is given all the authority, he is very, very strategic. He knows that if he just comes and says, okay, we're fixing the walls, the Shomronim, who live right outside, they live in the Shomron area, wait a minute, they're not going to be so happy about this. You're secluding them, right? So Nehemia, what he does, he doesn't reveal his true mission to everybody. He comes in as a governor, but it's still up for what does this new governor want to do, right? And the fact that the king gave him the authority to rebuild the walls, he doesn't reveal that until he examines and assesses the damage and the cost of labor of building the walls. He does it during night tours. He conducts night tours all over the walls, and he kind of starts making lists and start putting together. He doesn't want to do it during the day where people can see him. He does it during the night because he knows if he does it during the day, people might, these Shomronim, these foreigners, they're going to start, whoa, what's going on here, right? He didn't want the foreigners to nix his efforts on building the walls. On the other hand, we see once he starts building the walls, he's very forceful, and he does it with full force. And this a little bit allows us to tap into the world of politics during this time, even though the Persian Empire gave its full-fledged support to its new governor, the Nehemia. Other people had powers. The Shomronim had power, and not everybody followed the Persian rule. And that's one of the reasons why the Persian rule had many, many holes all over the place, and why Artaxerxes wanted to have allegiance in Yerushalayim, because he knows that there are little small areas, the Shomronim and the Ashdodim and others, possibly the Egyptians as well, who might rebel against him. So the more he empowers Jews whose allegiance is to the throne, the Persian throne, it's good for Persia. And that gives us kind of a little bit of an understanding of why the Persian kings kept on trying to help the Jews rebuild. They're not helping us to rebuild. They don't really, I don't think they care. Koresh did, as we saw there, because he wanted the support of the king of Judea, right? The God. But it seems that they have, one mindset, just like we see with Achashverosh before Darius before that. They want to make sure that their empire survives. Part of it means making sure that you give your support to your to the people that have their allegiance toward you. So that's maybe why he keeps on giving Jews authority to do as they like, because he knows Nehemia, who was a cupbearer, who was very close to him, will have his allegiance. So that's important to know. So from here we see how strategic Nehemia really was. Nehemia, regarding the wall, saw high importance in the construction of the walls, so that Yerushalayim, both in terms of its status and in terms of being a capital city, that's a capital city is supposed to be a stronghold, supposed to be a place where you look up to, hard to get into, right? Would be very strong, security and religiously as well. And what he does, because there are not a lot of people around who want to help, because who wants to start building? People have to survive. They don't want to start building. So he forces residents of Yerushalayim to assist in the construction, thereby also having them being part of something big. Some people, of course, volunteered, and we'll see that in the text inside. But it seems that many of the families and the settlements that surrounded Yerushalayim were not interested in this wall. And it was correct that Nehemia went around at nighttime, because once he started, he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he could start immediately. So these people who were living around Yerushalayim, they were concerned that by fortifying the city, it would keep them out of Yerushalayim, reducing trade, causing undesired rifts. So that's important. Another issue that Nehemia has to deal with is that since the city of Yerushalayim, which kind of resembles the Ir Atika, we're not talking about a gigantic, ginormous city. We're talking about a small area, and it was sparse of residents. So Nehemia, what he does, he needs to transfer residents to live inside Yerushalayim. I mean, it's nice to build a wall, but you have to have residents living inside in order to populate it, right? So what does he do? How does he do that? So he has the authority, but he's also a smart man. So what does he do? Through luck of a draw, he draws a lottery, and 1 in every 10 people are transferred to live in Yerushalayim. And here too, just like with the building of the wall, some decided to move voluntarily and live inside Yerushalayim. Thus, they strengthened the city. Nehemia also, from the economy in the area, he tries to strengthen that, right? So what he does, he encounters, I hinted at this before, he encounters a gap between the rich and the poor. Unfortunately, that always exists. You always have rich, you always have poor. That's why in halacha, and I said this a little bit on Shabbat, I hinted to this in my shiur in Hebrew between Mincha and Ma'ariv, that there's an obligation for the rich to give to the poor. Hashem, God, creates the poor and he creates the rich. Being rich doesn't mean you're better. Being poor doesn't mean you're worse, doesn't mean you're better. It just means that's what God gave you. The reason why that is so that each one can help each other, right? The rich can give to the poor enable the rich to give, so therefore they become givers, they care about the people, etc. And there's a halacha that we're supposed to help b'mechayeh the poor as well. And when Nehemia sees this, as I mentioned before, social justice is very, very important to Nehemia. And he sees this gap between the rich and the poor, the commoners, the peasants. They suffered for many, many, many years from drought. And what this led to the sale of their fields to the rich. We just talked about Shemitah and Karkaot and Yovel. And when that wasn't enough, the money that they got from the sale to support themselves, they were forced to sell themselves as slaves. We read in the Torah, when we read Yovel, we say, and slaves now go free after 50 years, after 6 years, every divri, etc. We say to ourselves, really? With that many slaves, Jews enslaved other Jews? The answer is yes, not because they were bad. It's because when people didn't have anything to eat, they sold themselves so they can eat something. And when there's heavy droughts and it's a difficult time to live in, that's what they did. And when Nehemia comes, he sees this terrible situation. He also sees that the Kohanim, who are enjoying tax exemption, but the poor are suffering, and the rich keep on getting richer. So Nehemia, through his political power, he persuades, and this he does use persuasion, because when it comes to the rich, he knows exactly what he's doing. He's a very smart politician, right? He knows that you can't force the rich because they have the money to defy power. So therefore, what he does, he persuades them. Unlike with Ezra, who persuades the entire population through spiritual endeavors, etc., and Nehemiah uses his power, his authority. Here, when it comes to the rich, he needs to use the power of persuasion, and he succeeds with the upper class to forgo their debts. Shmitat ksafim, right? Liberate the slaves. Mamash, as mentioned in the parasha. Shmita, Yovel, etc. Another thing that Nehemiah does is very important, and here we're starting to realize what the Gemara talks about, why Ezra and Nehemiah were so important to Am Yisrael, and that is the Torah Shebe'al Peh. So another important thing that he does is regarding Shabbat Kodesh. Shabbat. Before I get to the Shabbat, the status of the Kohanim and the Leviim have also been affected. This is regarding the rich and the poor, and therefore the rich didn't really give much donations to the Kohanim and the Leviim, and therefore the Kohanim and the Leviim stopped working in the Beit HaMikdash. That's what they stopped doing, and therefore the Beit HaMikdash has become neglected just because of money. So Nehemiah fixes that situation. He rebuilds and he allows the Kohanim and the Leviim to return to their work. Though he does find there are a couple of priests. They're always, unfortunately, people who work within the Kedusha Makom. Unfortunately, you always have that situation where people who work in a Kedusha Makom, Kohanim, Leviim, leaders, who take advantage of their situation, and they kind of reach into the treasures and they take it for themselves. So Nehemiah deals with them as well. So let's go back to Shabbat that I mentioned before. He cares about Shabbat very, very much, and he sees. Now it could be that Ezra did his job, but when there's nothing to eat and there's a lack of tradition of keeping Shabbos, the people revert to their old ways, especially when they have nothing to eat. So during this time when Nehemiah comes, according to our traditional approach, when he comes 13 years after Ezra, he sees that trade and was common on Shabbat in Yerushalayim, specifically by non-Jewish merchants. And this caused many Jews to work on Shabbat as well and desecrate Shabbat, mamash chilul Shabbat, in public, mifaresia. So Nehemiah struggles with this phenomenon, and he finds the best way to his ability to solve it. And what does he do? He simply closes the city gates every Shabbat. He just closes it off, and he doesn't let foreign traders in. Right? And ad kedei kach, we mentioned that he punishes them. He threatens all those. Nehemiah threatens and drives out anybody who's a foreigner, non-Jew, out of the city who's caught in Yerushalayim on Friday nights. And this is an opening to a whole new world of Yahadut, of secluding yourself, closing your gates, etc., putting in, Reshut HaYachid. But he succeeded. Trading was halted on Shabbat. Another important issue that he does, which is national, like the Brit Datit that Ezra also tried to do. So Nehemiah made basically an alliance, a covenant between the people in Yerushalayim and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They commit to discipline, to the leadership, and to fulfilling the Torah, mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah, in addition to other edicts that were put in place so that society, religious worship becomes elevated, which is the siftach, the entry of Torah Shebe'al Peh. For instance, Shemitah, the acceptance of the oral Torah as well. And it becomes the center of Judaism. And that's why today Torah Shebe'al Peh is so central. And he also returns the donations to the Beit HaMikdash, eliminating intermarriage, new intermarriage, keeping Shabbat, and he explains that you can't work on Shabbat, no transactions. He really goes through the halachic chukim and mishpatim of Shabbat. And this pact was one of Nehemiah's main reforms. So in a way, he does do similar things to Ezra, and that's one of his main reforms is Torah and Shabbat, but he does it be'ofen ma'asi, right? With actually doing, unlike Ezra did before. Again, we're not at the shlav, the time where we're summarizing both leaderships, but it becomes this way of life becomes a backbone of Yahadut, crystallizing and shaping Jewish identity, both nationally and religiously. And it wasn't just accepting the idea, but actually following it. And that was what was unique about Nehemiah's leadership. And this brit basically was divided into two parts that we're going to see a little later on in the Sefer. One, he succeeds in having the people actually sign an agreement and listing names. Who is signing? Who is mentioned here? So that they put their names down, mamash. And a full commitment from the people themselves to really be committed to following Torah or mitzvot. It could be that he did this in a formal way to illustrate the importance of the oral law, Torah shebe'al peh. Last but not least, he also unfortunately has to deal with intermarriage. And when I say to deal with intermarriage, it means that within those 13 years, according to our traditional approach, that Ezra was there still was intermarriage. And that's why, if you remember, I said way back when we learned about it from Ezra's point of view, that he falls down, he tears his garments, plucks the hairs out of his head, etc. And he makes lists and he goes through the whole, that it's a very, very difficult, intermarriage is a very difficult issue to deal with, because you don't want to, you can't tear families apart. What do? So we see this is an ongoing issue. Ezra had it, Nehemia had it, and in reality, it never really leaves us, which is, as I mentioned, when we learned this with Ezra, it's one of the biggest problems we have today. We're just losing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews to intermarriage. So Nehemia also fought against intermarriage, and he actually prevents this kind of marriage. He expels women and imposes heavy penalties on those that are married to foreign women. And interesting, as I mentioned before, Nehemia, after 12 years, he goes back to Persia. He goes back to Bavel. And we're going to ask why in the middle of everything he just leaves ups and goes home. 12 years, is that enough? So we'll have to deal with that as well. But he does come back for a second term. He comes back later. He hears what's going on in Yerushalayim, and he wants to strengthen his regulations and his decrees. And we see that that's very, very important for him. So we see the main difference, if you will, between Ezra and Nehemiah is that Ezra comes in and starts first with the spiritual atmosphere. He starts first with the reading of the Torah, celebration of Sukkot, and then he's told about intermarriage. Why did he not notice intermarriage? Because he knows that if he approaches the subject, he'll be stoned. But instead, he causes it to come from the people after he reads the Torah and convinces them that this is the wrong thing to do. Nehemiah, totally different type of leadership, comes into Yerushalayim and immediately starts to do. He builds the walls and he starts trying to strengthen social issues, etc., restoring the work in the Beit HaMikdash, and very, very different. But things are not going to be easy for Nehemiah. We will see where they meet as well, which goes hand in hand with the traditional approach that we followed as well. There's a lot to learn. Baruch Hashem, it's an amazing and a wonderful story. And once we go deeper into the personality of Nehemiah, we'll realize the differences and how each one, Ezra and Nehemiah, basically fill in for each other on what they both lack. So Be'ezrat Hashem, we will meet next week Sunday, Be'ezrat Hashem. So Shavua Tov.